January 1945 arrived with no sense of relief. Snow still covered the forests of the Ardennes, and the ground carried the scars of the last great German gamble in the West. The Battle of the Bulge had ended, but its echo lingered in exhausted divisions, shattered villages, and a command structure stretched by pressure, pride, and politics. At the center of this strain stood Dwight David Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe. His role had never been only military. From the beginning, his greatest task had been holding together an alliance of nations with different doctrines, histories, and ambitions. By early 1945, that task was harder than ever. Victory felt close, yet unity felt fragile. The winter offensive launched by German forces in December had exposed weaknesses not just in defensive lines, but in trust. American units had borne the heaviest fighting in the opening days, absorbing surprise attacks under brutal conditions. British forces, positioned to the north, had later taken a key role as the front stabilized. The battlefield demanded cooperation, but memory and interpretation of events quickly diverged once the shooting slowed. As the armies regrouped, attention shifted from the frozen forests to the words spoken far from the front. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commander of British land forces in the north, addressed the press. His remarks framed the battle as a carefully managed response under his guidance, emphasizing order, planning, and control. In doing so, he minimized the role of American commanders and formations that had fought and bled in the opening chaos. The reaction among senior American officers was immediate and severe. Many felt that the narrative being shaped in public erased their sacrifices and distorted reality. For them, the issue went beyond wounded pride. It threatened the credibility of command and the trust required to fight the final months of the war. Eisenhower understood the danger at once. Public disputes between Allied leaders were not just embarrassing. They were strategic risks. The enemy was watching, and so were governments back home. Any sign of fracture could weaken political support and complicate operations already stretched across supply lines and national sensitivities. Yet confronting Montgomery was never simple. The British Field Marshal was respected, experienced, and deeply conscious of his reputation. He believed strongly in his methods and in his role as a protector of British prestige within the alliance. His confidence bordered on certainty, and certainty left little room for humility. Eisenhower's leadership style stood in contrast. He rarely sought personal credit. His strength lay in patience, mediation, and an ability to let others feel valued even when they disagreed. For months, this approach had worked. But now the situation demanded something different. Silence would be read as acceptance. Delay would allow resentment to harden. Behind maps marked with arrows pushing toward the Rhine, Eisenhower weighed his options. He knew that removing Montgomery was politically impossible and militarily unwise. British leadership would not tolerate such a move, and the alliance could fracture beyond repair. At the same time, allowing Montgomery unchecked influence over American forces was no longer acceptable. The tension spread quietly through headquarters. Officers sensed that something had shifted. Orders became more precise. Lines of authority were restated with unusual clarity. Eisenhower was preparing to draw a line, not in public, but where it would matter most. The war was entering its final phase. Germany was weakening, but desperation made it dangerous. To finish the campaign, the Allies needed not just tanks and men, but trust. That trust was now under threat from within. As January advanced, Eisenhower resolved that the balance of the alliance had to be corrected before the final push eastward began. The decision would not be announced. It would not be celebrated. But it would change the shape of command in the West, and with it, the course of the closing months of the war. The snow continued to fall, quiet and indifferent, covering old blood and broken steel. Beneath that silence, the real battle was shifting from the front lines to the minds of those who commanded them. The headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force functioned like a living organism. Messages flowed in constant streams, maps were updated by the hour, and decisions made in quiet rooms reshaped the lives of millions at the front. By late January 1945, the atmosphere inside this system had changed. What once felt strained now felt brittle. Eisenhower observed the shifts carefully. Reports from field commanders carried subtle changes in tone. American generals spoke less freely about coordination with British forces. British staff officers grew more guarded when discussing operational control. None of this appeared in official communiques, yet it was visible to anyone watching closely. At the center of the strain remained Montgomery. His methodical approach to warfare had long earned him admiration. He valued preparation, clear phases, and firm control. These traits had served him well in earlier campaigns. But in the evolving reality of coalition warfare, they also created friction. Montgomery saw efficiency as a product of centralized authority. Eisenhower saw unity as a product of shared respect. The press episode following the Battle of the Bulge had not faded. Newspapers in the United States replayed Montgomery's words with increasing irritation. Congressional figures began questioning why American sacrifices seemed absent from the public narrative. The issue was no longer confined to military circles. It had reached the political bloodstream of the alliance. Eisenhower understood that leadership at his level required absorbing pressure before it exploded elsewhere. He began reshaping the structure of command in ways that appeared administrative on the surface. Operational boundaries were clarified. Responsibility for American forces was drawn more tightly under American commanders. Montgomery's role remained significant, but it was increasingly limited to British formations and defined sectors. These adjustments were deliberate. They avoided confrontation while correcting imbalance. Yet Montgomery noticed. To him, the changes felt like erosion. Influence once assumed now required negotiation. Authority once implied now arrived with conditions. The difference between the two men lay not only in temperament, but in philosophy. Montgomery believed victory justified strong control and public confidence. Eisenhower believed victory required restraint and discretion. Where Montgomery sought clarity through assertion, Eisenhower sought stability through balance. Behind the scenes, Eisenhower consulted widely. He spoke with senior American generals who had fought through the Ardennes. He listened to their frustrations and weighed them against the necessity of alliance politics. He also maintained steady communication with British leadership, careful not to frame the issue as national rivalry, but as functional necessity. Every decision carried risk. Too much firmness could provoke British resistance. Too much accommodation could fracture American confidence. Eisenhower walked this narrow path with intention, knowing that his authority rested not on rank alone, but on trust from all sides. As planning shifted toward the final offensive into Germany, operational tempo increased. Supply routes were stretched, weather remained unpredictable, and enemy resistance, though weakened, grew more desperate. In this environment, ambiguity in command could cost lives. Eisenhower began preparing for a moment that could no longer be avoided. A private reckoning was necessary. Not to humiliate, not to punish, but to reassert the principle that no individual, however capable, stood above the alliance itself. The decision was quiet, almost invisible. There would be no witnesses, no written record meant for public eyes. Yet the consequences would be lasting. The shape of Allied command was about to change, not through removal or rebuke, but through unmistakable authority exercised at exactly the right moment. As the armies massed along the western rivers of Germany, a confrontation moved closer, unseen by the soldiers who prepared for the final battles ahead. The next step would determine whether unity could survive ambition, and whether victory would be shared rather than claimed. The machinery of war continued its rhythm, unaware that one of its most critical adjustments was about to take place far from the sound of guns. The meeting took place away from maps crowded with observers and away from corridors filled with staff. It was arranged without ceremony, without aides, and without any intention of leaving a public trace. Eisenhower chose the setting carefully, a quiet room where authority would not be amplified by an audience, but by presence alone. By this point in the war, Eisenhower had learned that power expressed too loudly invited resistance. Power expressed with calm certainty left little room for misunderstanding. He entered the meeting not as a mediator, but as a commander prepared to define limits. Montgomery arrived carrying the confidence of a man accustomed to command. His reputation preceded him, built on earlier victories and reinforced by his own belief in his methods. He understood that the alliance needed him, and he had long acted with that assumption close at hand. The atmosphere was controlled, almost restrained. Outside, operations continued as planned. Inside, the real issue surfaced without raised voices or theatrical gestures. Eisenhower made clear that public statements had consequences beyond personal image. They shaped perception, loyalty, and the fragile balance of coalition warfare. The message was direct. Allied success was collective. No single commander could claim ownership of survival or victory. Any action that suggested otherwise weakened the alliance and undermined authority at the highest level. Eisenhower did not argue history. He defined responsibility. Montgomery listened, outwardly composed. Yet the shift was unmistakable. For the first time in months, he faced a boundary that could not be negotiated through prestige or persuasion. Eisenhower was not seeking apology. He was establishing control. The discussion moved from words to structure. Eisenhower outlined how command relationships would function going forward. American forces would answer to American commanders under the Supreme Command. Coordination would remain essential, but influence would no longer extend beyond clearly defined limits. This was not a demotion, but it felt like one. Montgomery retained rank, position, and responsibility, yet something intangible had been removed. The assumption of automatic authority over Allied forces was gone. Eisenhower's tone never hardened, yet it carried finality. The war was entering its closing phase, and clarity was no longer optional. The alliance could survive disagreement, but not confusion over who ultimately decided. When the meeting ended, there was no handshake meant for cameras and no record for archives. Both men left understanding that the balance had shifted. One had asserted command. The other had been reminded of its source. In the days that followed, the effects became visible without announcement. Operational directives flowed with sharper definition. American commanders acted with renewed confidence. British forces continued their role, disciplined and effective, but within boundaries now firmly set. Montgomery remained a respected figure, but his reach had shortened. Decisions once influenced by his voice now passed directly through Eisenhower's authority. The change reduced friction quietly, like pressure released from a sealed chamber. At the front, soldiers noticed nothing of the confrontation. They prepared for crossings, advances, and the final struggle ahead. Yet behind their movement stood a command structure newly aligned, steadier than it had been in months. The alliance held, not because egos vanished, but because one leader chose the moment to place unity above pride. The final campaign toward Germany's heartland would move forward under a command no longer in doubt. The war still demanded blood and endurance. But at its highest level, the struggle for control had been settled, silently and decisively. With authority clarified, the machinery of war began to move with renewed precision. Orders issued from Supreme Headquarters carried a tone that left little room for interpretation. Command relationships were no longer shaped by personality or reputation, but by structure. The alliance had entered a phase where efficiency mattered more than sentiment. As winter loosened its grip, Allied forces pushed eastward. The Rhine River loomed as the final natural barrier before the heart of Germany. Preparations for its crossing demanded coordination on a scale unmatched in the Western campaign. Supplies, engineering units, air cover, and timing had to align perfectly. Any confusion in command could unravel months of planning. Eisenhower remained the central node through which these efforts converged. His authority now functioned without hesitation. Decisions that once required careful negotiation moved forward with speed. The tone of planning meetings shifted. Focus returned to terrain, logistics, and enemy capability rather than internal balance. Montgomery continued to command British forces with discipline and method. His insistence on preparation shaped operations in his sector, but his influence no longer extended beyond it. This narrowing of scope reduced friction across the front. British and American formations advanced in parallel, coordinated rather than competing. The change was subtle but profound. Where once strategic direction risked fragmentation, it now flowed from a single source. Eisenhower did not seek attention for this transformation. He allowed results to speak. Advances accelerated. Coordination between ground and air forces improved. Momentum built steadily toward the interior of Germany. For soldiers at the front, the war remained immediate and unforgiving. Towns fell one by one. Resistance varied from stubborn defense to sudden collapse. Civilians emerged from cellars and ruins as Allied columns passed through landscapes reshaped by years of conflict. None of them knew that a quiet confrontation weeks earlier had helped make these advances possible. As March approached, Allied forces executed the crossings of the Rhine with overwhelming strength. Bridges were seized, rivers spanned, and defenses shattered. The enemy could no longer mount a coherent response across the breadth of the front. What remained was delay, not reversal. Within headquarters, Eisenhower watched the unfolding campaign with measured focus. The alliance had reached a state of balance rare in coalition warfare. British, American, and other Allied forces operated under a shared purpose, guided by a command structure that no longer bent under individual ambition. The decision made behind closed doors in January continued to shape every mile gained. Leadership had been redefined not through removal or spectacle, but through restraint applied at the right moment. Authority, once asserted, required no repetition. As the Allies pressed deeper into Germany, the war's end began to feel inevitable. Yet inevitability did not bring ease. The final phase would test endurance, discipline, and resolve. What had been secured was not peace, but the unity required to reach it. The campaign moved forward with steady force, carrying with it the consequences of a leadership choice that had altered the course of the war without ever appearing in headlines. Spring advanced quickly across a land that had little left to give. Roads once marked by retreat now filled with advancing columns. German resistance no longer followed a grand design. It fractured into isolated stands shaped by desperation rather than strategy. The end approached not with silence, but with exhaustion. Within the Allied command, clarity held. Decisions flowed without hesitation. The balance established earlier in the year continued to hold, steady and unchallenged. The alliance moved as one force, not because differences had disappeared, but because they no longer dictated direction. Eisenhower remained firm at the center of this momentum. His leadership was quiet, almost invisible, yet unmistakable. He did not chase triumph or recognition. His attention stayed fixed on coordination, timing, and the prevention of unnecessary loss. Authority, once secured, required no reinforcement. Montgomery carried out his responsibilities with discipline and precision. His reputation endured, but its shape had changed. No longer the dominant voice across national lines, he operated within a system that valued contribution over command. The adjustment was permanent, and it held. As Allied forces advanced deeper into Germany, the scale of destruction became undeniable. Cities lay broken. Infrastructure collapsed. Civilians moved through ruins shaped by years of war and months of relentless pressure. The battlefield expanded beyond soldiers, touching everything in its path. Behind the front, planning shifted from attack to occupation. Lines on maps now marked zones of control rather than objectives. The machinery of war slowed, not from hesitation, but from completion. The enemy had nowhere left to withdraw. The surrender in the West came without drama. It arrived as a confirmation rather than a revelation. The final orders carried no emotion. They were brief, precise, and definitive. Years of coordination, compromise, and command resolved into a single outcome. No public record marked the confrontation that had helped preserve this unity. No monument named the moment authority was reclaimed. Yet its effect endured in the cohesion that carried the alliance through the final weeks without fracture. Leadership at this level left no room for pride to stand alone. It demanded restraint, timing, and the willingness to confront when silence threatened collapse. Eisenhower had chosen that moment, and the alliance had endured because of it. As the guns fell quiet, what remained was not a story of personalities, but of structure. Not of victory claimed by one voice, but of control exercised to protect many. The war ended as it had been fought in its final months, under a command no longer in question, moving forward until there was nowhere left to go.